The cameras found them all at once. Bright studio lights hummed with electricity, casting their sharp glow across the polished stage. The air in the room felt thick with anticipation, heavy with the weight of what millions of Americans knew was coming. From kitchen tables across the heartland to crowded sports bars in every major city, from dimly lit bedrooms where young people scrolled on their phones to nursing homes where veterans gathered around communal televisions, the nation had stopped to watch. This was the showdown America had been waiting for. The debate stage was immaculate, almost surgical in its precision. 3 podiums stood arranged in a careful triangle, each one illuminated by its own pool of light. The moderators sat off to the side, their faces carefully neutral, their notes arranged in neat stacks before them. Behind the stage, enormous screens displayed the network logo, pulsing softly, as if the very backdrop was breathing with anticipation. And on that stage sat the 3 men who would make this night unforgettable. Former President Barack Obama occupied the center position. His posture composed but alert. He wore his signature confidence like a well-tailored suit, his expression measured and ready. There was a stillness about him that suggested calculation, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. His eyes moved deliberately across the room, taking in the crowd, the cameras, and most importantly, his opponents. To his right sat President Donald Trump, every inch the larger-than-life presence that had dominated American politics for nearly a decade. His suit was immaculate, his red tie a bold statement against the blue backdrop. He leaned back in his chair with the casual confidence of a man who had faced down countless adversaries and emerged victorious. His expression was inscrutable, but there was energy in his stillness, like a coiled spring waiting for the right moment to release. And then there was Vice President JD Vance. Younger than his counterparts by decades, Vance sat with a steady composure that belied his relative inexperience on this particular stage. His jaw was set with quiet determination, his eyes clear and focused. He was the sort of man who looked like he had been waiting for his cue, patient and prepared, knowing that his moment would come. The cameras lingered on him briefly before moving on, not yet aware of the role he would play before the night was over. Before we go deeper into this story, take a second and hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like and let us know where you're watching from. I'm curious to know how far these stories travel. The first question landed like a thrown glove, sharp and challenging. How is the country doing 200 days into President Trump's second term? The audience sucked in a collective breath. It was the kind of question that demanded more than policy talking points. It demanded a reckoning with the state of the nation itself. Moderators glanced down at their notes, their pens hovering over paper, ready to capture whatever came next. Barack Obama leaned forward, his expression sharpened, the measured calm giving way to something harder and more focused. When he spoke, his words came slowly, deliberately, each syllable carefully chosen for maximum impact. His voice carried that familiar cadence, the rhythmic precision that had once made him the most captivating speaker in American politics. In just 200 days, Obama began, his tone cold and controlled, this administration has dismantled what we worked so hard to build. He paused, letting the accusation hang in the air like smoke after an explosion. You've undone progress, Donald. You govern with insults and impulse. It's reckless. It's beneath this office. The words cut through the studio like a blade, precise, unapologetic, designed to wound. The audience sat frozen, processing what they had just heard. A former president had just publicly called the current president reckless and unfit. This wasn't subtle political sparring. This was a direct assault on Donald Trump's legitimacy, his competence, and his character. Trump said nothing at first. It was a rare moment of stillness from the man who had built his political career on roaring back at every critic, answering every attack with a counterattack twice as fierce. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes flickered with something that might have been calculation or might have been amusement. Around him, eyes flicked nervously from face to face. Some in the crowd murmured their assent, nodding along with Obama's words. Others bristled visibly, their faces tightening with disagreement. The room was a microcosm of America itself, divided down the middle, waiting to see which way the momentum would swing. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards, already crafting the headlines that would dominate the morning news cycle. Obama delivers blistering. Rebuke to Trump. Former president calls Trump presidency reckless. The narrative was being written in real time, but Obama wasn't finished. He straightened in his chair, his voice gaining steam as he pressed his advantage. The practiced orator was in his element now, building his argument with the precision of a master craftsman. There's no record worth celebrating here, Obama continued. The same chaos that marked your first term is back. Your allies are mocked, our institutions ridiculed. America deserves better. It was the kind of takedown that made headlines before the debate even finished. The words were harsh, the delivery merciless. Obama had come to this stage with a clear mission: to tear down Donald Trump's presidency in the court of public opinion. And for a moment, it seemed like he might succeed. The room tilted in his direction. The applause from certain sections of the audience was enthusiastic, almost triumphant. Obama's supporters felt vindicated, watching their champion deliver the kind of passionate condemnation they had been waiting to hear. Social media exploded with clips of the exchange, the words spreading across the digital landscape like wildfire. But the drama didn't stop with Obama's lines. The room pivoted toward the vice president. JD Vance sat up straighter in his chair, his hands steady on the desk before him. His jaw was tight with focus, but there was no panic in his expression, no sign of a man overwhelmed by the moment. He had not interrupted Obama's assault. He hadn't needed to. When Vance exhaled and began to speak, the hush that followed felt almost ceremonial. The room held its breath, uncertain of what was coming, but sensing that something significant was about to unfold. "Mr. Obama," Vance began, his voice calm but fierce, cutting through the residual applause like a knife through silk. Obama's eyebrows rose slightly, perhaps surprised that the younger man would address him directly rather than waiting for his turn. "You've had your say," Vance continued, his tone measured and controlled. "But let's be honest about what you call leadership." He looked at the camera, not just across the stage. In that moment, he wasn't speaking only to Barack Obama. He was speaking to every American watching from their living room, every citizen who had tuned in, hoping to see something real, something true. When 2016 didn't go the way you wanted, you and your allies pushed a narrative, the Russia collusion story that tore the fabric of our politics. The words landed like hammer blows. It was a campaign to nullify the people's choice. That wasn't democracy, that was betrayal. The reaction was immediate. Audible gasps rippled through the studio, a wave of shock that moved from one side of the room to the other. Obama's expression tightened, the confident smile that had graced his face moments earlier flattening into something harder and more defensive. His eyes narrowed slightly, reassessing the young man before him. This was not the response he had expected. Vance didn't wait for applause. He didn't pause for the room to catch up. He kept going, his voice rising with conviction, each word building on the last like bricks in a fortress of argument. "You accuse this president of arrogance," Vance said, his gaze locked on Obama's face. "But you were the one operating from behind the curtain, directing narratives while others did the heavy lifting. You and your circle ignored the concerns of everyday Americans. You left communities behind." The audience was transfixed now, watching something they hadn't anticipated. The young vice president, whom many had dismissed as a supporting player in Trump's drama, was emerging as something else entirely: a fighter, a voice. "And while you lecture tonight," Vance continued, his voice gaining strength with each phrase, "our borders opened wider. Crime and drugs seeped into towns, and people who felt abandoned looked for a different path." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "They voted for it twice. You can't accept that." The studio broke. People in the live audience began to stand, to shout, to clap. It was a chorus of emotion that reflected the split-screen America watching from home. Millions followed every syllable on their phones, their tablets, their televisions. Social media feeds refreshed frantically as clips began their inevitable spread. Trump leaned back with a small, satisfied nod. His expression remained carefully controlled, but there was unmistakable approval in his posture. He had chosen this man as his running mate, and in this moment, that choice was being vindicated in spectacular fashion. Reporters scrambled for quotes, already restructuring their stories. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman's hands trembled as she wiped at her cheeks. Someone behind her whispered, voice thick with emotion, "Finally!" Finally, someone had said what they were feeling. Finally, someone had pushed back. The battle for the night's narrative had only just begun. Obama tried to reclaim the floor. He straightened his jacket with practiced precision, pushed his hair back in that familiar gesture that millions had watched throughout his presidency. His eyes shot toward Vance, carrying both rebuke and disbelief. This was not how the evening was supposed to unfold. He had come to this debate as the elder statesman, the voice of reason and experience, ready to dismantle Trump's record with surgical precision. He had not anticipated being challenged by the vice president. "JD," Obama said, his voice sharp with controlled frustration, "don't flatter yourself as some independent voice." The words were meant to diminish, to reduce Vance to what Obama clearly considered his proper station: a surrogate, a defender, nothing more. "Defending this administration doesn't make you principled," Obama continued, his tone gaining an edge that betrayed his irritation. "It makes you complicit. This presidency has isolated our country, humiliated allies, and turned the dignity of the office into a spectacle." It was a sharp retort, the kind of verbal counterpunch that had served Obama well throughout his political career. But something had changed in the room. The energy had shifted, not uniformly but noticeably. A few in the audience booed, others frowned, their expressions skeptical in ways they hadn't been before. The authority that Obama had carried into this debate, the assumption that his words would land with unchallenged power, was fracturing before his eyes. The studio audience was no longer a unified entity responding to his charisma. It had become something more complicated, more divided. Vance's posture never wavered. He folded his fingers on the desk before him, his expression steady and composed. When he responded, his voice was quieter than before, but somehow harder, more dangerous. "Sir, I'm not complicit," Vance said, each word deliberate and weighted. "I was elected alongside him. I took an oath to the American people." He let that statement hang in the air for a moment, a reminder that his authority came from the same democratic process that Obama had spent years championing. "We're not beholden to the same set of interests you served," Vance continued. "We put the focus back on manufacturing, on secure borders, on putting citizens first." His voice rose slightly, gaining momentum. "You speak about dignity, but how does that square with the attempts to delegitimize an election because it didn't go your way? How does that look to the people whose votes you dismissed?" The question hung in the air like a thrown challenge, demanding an answer that Obama couldn't easily provide. Vance's words landed with the bluntness of someone swinging a hammer. There was no diplomatic hedging, no political doublespeak designed to soften the blow. He was speaking directly to the grievances that millions of Americans had carried for years, giving voice to frustrations that had been dismissed and ridiculed by the political establishment. He circled back to the heart of his argument, naming names, invoking 2017, the investigations, the headlines that had dominated the news cycle for years and never quite stopped. "You and others pushed a theory that fractured trust in our institutions," Vance said, his gaze steady on Obama's face. "That wasn't oversight. That was an effort to overturn the democratic will. And that matters to millions who felt their voices were stolen." For a moment, the studio seemed to suspend itself, breathless. The moderators exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to intervene or let the exchange continue. Camera lenses locked on Obama, whose face had gone compact and controlled. He opened his mouth, then closed it. A small, almost invisible recalibration. Across living rooms throughout America, viewers paused mid-scroll as clips began their inevitable spread across social media. The debate that had been promised fireworks had become something sharper, something that cut deeper than political theater. It had become a battle of narratives, a contest over who would get to define the past and lay claim to the future. Vance's words had reached something in the American psyche. His accusations were bold, uncomfortable, and at the same time balanced in the way they resonated with people who had felt disregarded for years. He wasn't just defending Trump, he was speaking for every factory worker who had watched their job disappear overseas, every small-town resident who had buried a loved one to drug overdoses, every citizen who had felt their concerns dismissed by coastal elites who claimed to know better. Trump watched with steadfast satisfaction, allowing the moment to play until its natural conclusion. He didn't need to speak. Every nod of approval said everything that needed to be said. His vice president was doing exactly what he had been chosen to do, fighting. Obama returned to the attack. He was harsher now, his voice edged with impatience that he could no longer fully conceal. The composed statesman was giving way to something more human, more frustrated. "You can spin the past all you want," Obama said, his tone carrying a sharp edge. "But the facts remain. This administration has harmed America's standing, trampled norms, and eroded the trust of our allies. Historians will judge this term harshly." The response in the room was uneven. Some clapped politely, their applause mechanical rather than enthusiastic. Others booed openly. The tide that had once seemed to be rolling in Obama's direction had fractured, and new currents were pulling toward Vance's framing of the debate. The former president's composure flickered. It was clear he hadn't expected the younger conservative to cut through the way he did. Obama had faced countless adversaries throughout his career, but there was something different about this confrontation. Vance wasn't playing by the old rules. He wasn't deferring to Obama's status or his reputation. He was attacking head-on, challenging the very foundations of Obama's legacy. Vance moved in for the close, his voice steady, every syllable deliberate. "You talk about facts," Vance said, his eyes never leaving Obama's face. "And the people remember factories closed, jobs lost, promises made and forgotten. They remember communities hollowed out." He paused, letting the images settle in the minds of his audience. They also remember the push to undermine an outcome because it wasn't the result you wanted. That's not leadership. That's trying to rewrite the rules when you lose. The accusation was devastating in its simplicity. The American people saw that and chose differently. The studio broke into a bout of cheering and weeping. It was that excited, unclean kind of sound that makes newspapers and feeds social media platforms, the raw emotion of millions of people finally feeling like someone was speaking for them. Obama scanned the room, looking for purchase, as applause rolled in waves across the floor. The story had gone off balance, at least for that night. Millions in the audience felt like they had witnessed a turning point in real time. It was easy to remember that exchange as the moderators tried desperately to bring the discussion back on track to policy, but the moment had already transcended policy. It had become something personal, something visceral. Clips of Vance's retort were already looping online. Pundits began to pass the exchange, trying to place it in the arc of the larger political conversation. For many who watched, it wasn't just another zinger in a long season of televised skirmishes. It felt definitive, the moment when a younger generation spoke back, and for a heartbeat, changed how the country would remember the argument. The power Obama had once held was slipping through his fingers, and JD Vance was only just getting started. His voice found a new edge now, each sentence landing like a hammer. "You call President Trump arrogant," Vance said, his voice steady and hard. "But what you call arrogance is a cover for a manufactured story. Whispers about Russia meant to tarnish a victory you couldn't accept." He leaned forward, his intensity increasing. "Arrogance is pretending Joe Biden was fit when he wasn't because you wanted a puppet. Arrogance is thinking you could keep fooling the American people forever." The studio erupted. People stood from their seats, some waving small flags they had brought to the event. Tears shone on faces throughout the audience. The camera swept across the crowd, catching raw reactions that ranged from anger to relief to disbelief. This was no longer a debate, it was a reckoning. Trump leaned in toward JD and murmured something only the two of them could hear. Vance nodded without breaking his gaze from Obama, his composure locked in place like armor. "Here's the truth, sir," Vance said, each word deliberate and weighted with conviction. "You weren't safeguarding America, you were safeguarding your interests. You made fortunes while ordinary families lost everything. That's why this moment terrifies you, because the truth finally caught up." Obama stiffened. The comment landed cleaner than he had anticipated. The practiced politician, the man who had spent his career controlling narratives and shaping public perception, found himself on the defensive in ways he clearly hadn't expected. The moderators could not restrain the room anymore. The hall was already beyond control. Something had shifted. The moment had fallen into JD's hands, and he wasn't letting go. There was electricity in the studio, the charged atmosphere that precedes a storm. The moderators floundered, uncertain whether to intervene or let events take their course. This was live television, and anything could happen next. Obama sat back and worked his jaw, pride smarting, but not yet entirely extinguished. He was regrouping, recalculating, trying to find his footing in a debate that had slipped from his control. Outside the studio, the impact was immediate. Social platforms lit up with activity that overwhelmed servers and trending algorithms. "Vance shuts down Obama" trended within minutes. Clips multiplied exponentially as viewers clicked and reshared the exchange. Commentary flooded in from every corner of the political spectrum. A retired Marine in Florida dabbed at his eyes and whispered to his wife, "Finally, someone speaks for us." A single mum in Detroit punched the air from her couch and shouted at her television, "That's it, JD! Say it!" The scene at home mirrored the chaos in the studio. Phones held high, families leaning forward, children asking their parents what was happening. The moderator's plea for order barely registered over the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, let's keep order." But the night had morphed into something else entirely, a reckoning, and JD Vance had sparked something that felt impossible to extinguish. JD Vance sat upright in his chair, shoulders squared, eyes fixed with unwavering determination. There was no hesitation in him now. Whatever nervousness he might have felt at the beginning of the evening had been burned away by the fire of conviction. He wasn't just defending Trump anymore, he was speaking for the people who felt abandoned, overlooked, and betrayed by a political establishment that had promised them hope and delivered despair. And the crowd recognized it. They felt it in their bones. This connection between the young vice president's words and their own lived experiences. Obama rose to answer, but his voice wavered in ways it hadn't before. The confident orator who had captivated millions throughout his career seemed uncertain, reaching for words that had always come so easily. "You can shout all you want, JD," Obama said, his tone defensive rather than commanding. "But shouting doesn't make falsehoods true." He straightened in his chair, trying to reclaim his authority. "The truth is, President Trump divided this nation. His reckless choices harmed minority communities, strained alliances, and damaged America's standing abroad. History won't forgive that. The words drew polite applause from certain sections of the audience. But the force behind them had thinned. Obama no longer filled the room with the same unquestioned authority he had commanded at the debate's beginning. He seemed to be scrambling to hold the floor rather than dominating it. JD leaned in, calm and unsparing. "Mr. Obama," he replied, his voice steady as granite, "history doesn't let off leaders who misled their people." The statement hung in the air, heavy with implication. It won't excuse open borders, the flood of drugs into neighborhoods, towns left to rot, while elites prospered. That was your record. A collective intake of breath swept through the audience. People shifted in their seats, processing the directness of the accusation. This was not the carefully hedged language of traditional political discourse. This was blunt truth, delivered without apology. Obama tried a tight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Sweat beaded at his temple, visible under the harsh studio lights. The composure that had been his trademark was cracking, piece by piece. Trump watched from his position, arms folded across his chest, a satisfied smirk forming on his face. For years, critics had painted Trump as fighting alone, isolated against the political establishment. Tonight, that perception was shifting dramatically. Vance stood as his own force, not merely a deputy, but a leader in his own right, a partner rather than a subordinate. JD's voice rose, cutting through the background noise with precision. "You accused President Trump of splitting the country," he said, his words measured and devastating. "But you split it long before him." He paused, letting the accusation land. "You promised hope and change, then left millions in despair. You watched factories close and jobs vanish as you and your circle grew wealthier." Before we continue, take a second and share your thoughts so far on this story below. I read every single one. The statement landed like a physical blow. Silence, stunned and incomplete, filled the studio. Even the moderators stayed still, uncertain how to proceed. "And let's be clear," JD continued, pointing toward Obama with a composed intensity that commanded attention. "When you talk about corruption, remember what you allowed. You pushed forward a candidate who was visibly diminished while people behind the curtain pulled the strings. That wasn't leadership. It was manipulation. It was betrayal." The audience roared back in response. Some sobbed openly, overwhelmed by the emotion of hearing words they had wanted to hear for years. Others raised their hands to the ceiling, chanting agreement. Veterans stood at attention. Mothers clutched their children. The studio had transformed from a television set into a crucible of raw American emotion. Obama tried to reply. His sentence stumbled and sputtered against the wall of clapping and cheers. The words that had always come so easily to him seemed to catch in his throat, unable to compete with the energy that JD had unleashed. In that instant, the balance in the room had shifted irrevocably. It felt like watching a titan falter, like witnessing the passing of an era in real time. A new figure had claimed the spotlight, and the imprint would last far beyond this single evening. JD's words had landed the decisive strike. When JD finished that particular exchange, a heavy silence followed, the kind of silence that carries the weight of something witnessed, something that cannot be unwatched or unheard. Across the country, living rooms were motionless, coffee cooled in mugs forgotten on end tables. Families leaned forward in their chairs, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and hope. Social feeds burned as every second produced another clip, another reaction, another share. The hashtags had moved on from their earlier trajectories. This moment belonged to Vance. On stage, Obama shifted uncomfortably. The practiced command that had always characterized his public appearances was cracking under pressure. A moderator, uneasy and uncertain, asked, "Mr. Obama, would you like to respond?" He cleared his throat, but the tone was different now, less certain, more defensive. He was cornered, and everyone in that studio knew it. Trump reclined in his chair with regal calm, letting his vice president take the fight. The optics were unmistakable to anyone watching. JD Vance, once considered a supporting figure in the Trump political operation, was stepping into the role of a leader people would want to follow. "Look," Obama began, his voice strained, "politics is rough, emotions run high, but accusing me of funneling billions to corruption, that's absurd." The room didn't respond with outrage or defense. It answered with weary silence, the kind of silence that signals people are done with explanations, done with defenses, done with the same old political answers to questions that deserved something more. JD seized the moment, his eyes narrowing with focus. "Mr. Obama, Americans are done being told the truth is ridiculous." They felt the consequences firsthand. His voice carried the weight of millions of stories, millions of struggles that had been dismissed and ignored. They've watched their towns hollow out. They've buried loved ones because of drugs flooding through borders left unsecured. He paused, letting the human cost of policy failures settle over the room. That's not an exaggeration, it's their reality. Around the studio, flags pressed against chests, hands tightened into fists. The debate had become more than politicians pitting arguments against arguments. It had become a mirror held up to people's losses and grievances, and for many watching, JD Vance had just given that mirror a name. The studio exploded into applause. People were on their feet, clapping until their palms reddened with the effort. Obama looked taken aback, his usual composure shattered. Every attempt he made to soften JD's accusations only seemed to dig him in deeper. JD wasn't finished. He sat up straighter, composed but fierce, ready to deliver another line that would reverberate well beyond the stage. JD Vance squared his shoulders and spoke with a precision that snapped every camera to him. "You call my words dishonest, Mr. Obama, but the folks in this room know the truth." He gestured toward the audience, including them in his argument, making them partners in the conversation. The factory hands who lost their pensions, mothers who buried sons to overdoses, veterans left without care while others lined their pockets. His voice grew stronger with each example. These aren't talking points, they're American lives, and they remember who let them down. The crowd broke. Some wept openly, tears streaming down faces that had held too much grief for too long. Others cheered, their voices raw with emotion. A veteran in the front row rose slowly and offered a salute, his hand trembling. A woman in the back covered her face and sobbed. It felt less like politics and more like something deeply personal, like a wound being acknowledged for the first time, like a truth being spoken that had been suppressed for years. JD's voice found steadiness, then strength. "You mock President Trump," he continued. "But he's the first leader in years to put America first. He brought work back. He closed loopholes. He fought for people who'd been forgotten." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "Yes, his style is loud, but sometimes truth has to be loud to be heard." Obama's composure faltered completely now. The camera cut to the young vice president who had just quieted a former president. And across the country, millions watched with eyes full of tears, pride, relief, hope. Emotions that had been dormant for years, awakened by words that finally gave voice to what people had been feeling in the silence of their own hearts. Clips of JD's lines flooded social feeds within minutes. Teenagers on TikTok set his words to patriotic music. Grandmothers on Facebook shared the video with captions like, "Finally someone brave." Hashtags trended. Newsrooms scrambled to reframe headlines that had been written assuming a very different outcome. What had been built as a night where Obama would dominate had flipped completely. JD Vance had become the voice for millions. People replayed the moment in diners, in bars, in living rooms across America. Some cried, some cheered along with their screens. A crew of steel workers in Pennsylvania rose together and chanted his name. Back on stage, Obama grew visibly uneasy. His attempt to paint Trump as a failure had rebounded spectacularly, and the spotlight was now firmly on the young vice president, who was rising like a storm. Trump allowed a faint smile to cross his face. He recognized that this night had shifted into something beyond policy debates and political arguments. It had become about faith, about pride, about the simple courage of speaking plainly to power. And JD Vance had delivered. Obama leaned in, his tone slowing, taking on an almost pleading quality that his supporters had never heard before. "America isn't perfect," he said, his voice losing some of its earlier edge. "We all stumble. I tried to bring dignity, respect, unity to this office." He straightened, attempting to reclaim the moral high ground. "I sought to build bridges, not walls. I won't let you tarnish what we fought for." A handful of polite claps met his words, but they sounded thin, scattered, almost apologetic in the vast space of the studio. The authority that had once electrified rooms felt muted next to the raw intensity JD had ignited. The comparison was stark and uncomfortable. One man defending a legacy, another man speaking for the people who had been left behind by that legacy. JD waited patiently, letting Obama's words dissipate into the air. Then, deliberate and cutting, he replied, "Dignity, unity." He let the words hang there, heavy with irony. "Tell that to the veterans who can't afford care. Tell that to workers whose livelihoods vanished when jobs went overseas. Tell that to the families with empty chairs because drugs poured through our borders." His voice grew harder, more insistent. "That was the outcome under your watch." The audience gasped collectively. A man in the front row bowed his head and whispered, barely audible but captured by the sensitive microphones, That was my son, and the cameras caught it. The raw grief on his face, the weight of personal loss transformed into political argument. Suddenly the country felt the weight of his sorrow. This wasn't abstract policy debate anymore. This was a father who had buried his child, watching someone finally speak the truth about the failures that had cost him everything. Obama visibly tightened. The debate had been transformed into something human and immediate, something that couldn't be answered with political talking points or rhetorical flourishes. And the nation watched, moved. JD leaned forward again, his voice measured and resonant. Mr. Obama, here's the plain truth, he paused, ensuring every word would land with maximum impact. You don't despise Donald Trump because he failed. You despise him because he succeeded where you did not. The accusation was devastating in its simplicity. He gave voice to the forgotten. He put America first. That's why people rallied behind him. His words crashed through the studio like thunder. The room broke loose in response, tears and clapping that shook the walls. Mothers held their children close, whispering words of hope. Veterans saluted with shaking hands, their faces wet with emotion they couldn't contain. Faces throughout the crowd were wet with tears. Obama was trying to open his mouth, searching for words, but nothing came. The practiced orator, the man who had built his entire political career on the power of speech, was thunderstruck, speechless in the most literal sense. Trump leaned toward JD and murmured one word, barely audible but captured by the cameras. Perfect. Across living rooms throughout America, families embraced. Some dropped to their knees in prayer, grateful that someone had finally said what they felt. Parents held their children and pointed at the screen, telling them to remember this moment. Remember what courage looked like. The moderators tried to regain control of the proceedings. But the stage had been overtaken. It was no longer a scripted exchange between political figures. It was a reckoning. And JD Vance had sparked something that felt impossible to extinguish. The studio now felt less like television and more like the nation's pulse beating in real time. Cameras lingered on faces throughout the audience, people wiping tears from their cheeks. Veterans standing proud, their backs straight despite their years, ordinary citizens clasping hands with strangers as if a long-awaited truth had finally been spoken aloud. Watch parties in homes across America shifted into quiet gatherings, then into prayer circles. In a West Virginia town, coal miners bowed their heads together, grateful to finally be seen, grateful that someone with a platform had acknowledged their struggles. In Detroit, a family gathered around an old television and whispered to each other, "This is history, this is hope." Obama shifted in his seat, trying to marshal his authority, but the energy in the room had moved on. His familiar gravitas was being drowned by the tide JD had unleashed. He pushed forward, sharpening his tone in one final attempt to regain control. "JD," Obama said, his voice carrying a patronizing edge, "you're young and ambitious. Don't confuse dramatic moments for leadership." He straightened, trying to project the authority of experience. "History will judge you and President Trump, and it may not be kind. The country will remember the damage." He tried to summon the old fire, the rhetorical brilliance that had once made him the most captivating speaker in American politics. But the crowd's sympathy had gone elsewhere. The connection he had always been able to forge with audiences seemed broken. Applause scattered, thin and unconvincing. Most viewers sat with crossed arms and heavy thoughts. The magic wasn't working anymore. JD listened patiently, then spoke with a calm that cut through the noise like a blade. "Mr. Obama," he said, his voice steady and assured, "history is watching, and tonight it saw something important." He leaned forward, his eyes meeting Obama's directly. "Leadership is not polished speeches, it's results. Look at the results." He began to enumerate, each phrase landing like a hammer blow. Broken families, porous borders, promises left unkept. Thunderous applause answered him. A chant rose up from the audience, building in intensity. "USA, USA, USA!" The sound filled the studio, drowning out everything else. The moderator's attempts to restore order were futile. The chant washed over the stage like a wave, carrying with it the emotion of millions who were watching from home. Obama's face fell. The moment had slipped from his grasp completely. The debate he had entered, confident of dominating, had become his most public defeat. The narrative had been wrested from his control, and there was nothing he could do to reclaim it. By the time the lights dimmed slightly and the cameras pulled back for a wider shot, the debate had become more than a contest of arguments. It had become a crossroads, an evening when a young vice president's words pierced the nation's quiet ache and for many finally gave it a voice. If you were in JD Vance's shoes, standing on that stage, facing the weight of a nation's expectations and the sharp criticism of a former president, what would you do? Would you have spoken up the same way? Share your thoughts in the comments. Obama weakened with every line he spoke. while JD Vance seemed to grow steadier and firmer with each passing second. The contrast was stark and undeniable, one man diminishing, another rising. Vance straightened in his chair, leaned into the microphone, and fixed his gaze on Obama with unwavering intensity. His delivery was measured, slow, precise, the kind of delivery that makes words impossible to forget. "You say President Trump is dangerous," Vance began, his voice carrying throughout the silent studio. "You say he's arrogant." He paused, letting the accusations hang in the air. "But the truth is plain." He leaned forward, his next words carrying the weight of conviction. "Donald Trump returned this country to its people. You, Mr. Obama, tried to take it away." The studio held its breath. "You won't be remembered as a builder of hope. You'll be remembered as someone who tried to quiet it." The studio erupted. People stood from their seats, cheering, clapping, weeping. Flags waved throughout the audience. Strangers embraced each other, overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. The atmosphere surged with an energy that felt fierce, electric, unstoppable. Obama sat motionless, words failing him completely. His silence carried as much weight as any rebuttal ever could. The great speaker had been rendered speechless by a younger man with the courage to speak truth to power. Trump reached over and laid a hand on Vance's shoulder. The pride on his face was plain for everyone to see. Cameras caught the moment from multiple angles, and the image spread instantly across screens throughout the world. The president and his vice president stood together, unmoved by the chaos around them, united. Outside the studio, spontaneous celebrations erupted. Fireworks speckled the night sky in communities across America. Car horns honked in celebration. Neighbors who had gathered to watch emerged from their homes to share the moment with others. A defining instant had unfolded on live television. Vance had not only defended the president, he had etched himself into the evening's history in a way that would be remembered for years to come. "USA! USA!" rose through the room again, shaking the very foundations of the set. Cameramen fought to keep their shots steady as the crowd's energy nearly overtook them. Families lifted children high on their shoulders so they could witness the moment. Some bawled openly, unable to contain their emotion. Others simply stared at the screen, overwhelmed by what they were witnessing. Obama's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered about the room, searching for allies, for support, for something to hold on to. He had weathered tough political fights before. He had faced hostile crowds and difficult questions throughout his career, but this felt different. This wasn't a debate of policy. This was a laying bare of conviction, and in that contest, JD Vance had emerged victorious. Vance pivoted from the former president to the audience, both in the studio and watching from home. His voice softened slightly, becoming more personal, more intimate. "This isn't about left or right," he said, his words carrying to every corner of the room and beyond. "Not Republican or Democrat." He paused, letting the partisan labels fall away. "It's about America." The simplicity of the statement cut through the political noise that had dominated the evening. America needs leaders who stand with its people, not those who sell them out for power. Across living rooms and kitchens throughout the nation, people cheered. A farmer in Iowa shut off his tractor, turned to his young son, and said with emotion in his voice, "That's courage. Remember that, boy. That's what courage looks like." Trump caught Vance's eye and smiled, a small, knowing curve of the lips that communicated more than words ever could. The president was aware that the night had shifted into something beyond a political debate. It was no longer about a clash between two men or two parties. It had become the moment JD Vance stepped forward onto the national stage as a leader in his own right. Obama leaned in, his voice strained with frustration he could no longer hide. "You can stand there and lecture me, JD," he said, "but history will judge what Donald Trump has done. You may win applause tonight, but time will reveal the rest." His words carried a bitterness that didn't ring true to the crowd. The applause that followed was muted, scattered. Murmurs of discontent drifted through the studio. The speeches that had once defined Obama's legacy no longer landed with the same force. The man who had been called the greatest orator of his generation seemed diminished, his words hollow against the raw authenticity of his opponent. Vance closed in on the microphone again, calm, cutting, certain. "Mr. Obama," he said, his voice steady, "performances are built on lines. Truth needs no spectacle." The observation was devastatingly simple. Under your watch, families lost faith. Under Trump, they found it again. That's not theater. That's reality. The crowd surged again, tears and cheers blending into a single tide of emotion that swept through the studio. Obama leaned back in his chair, visibly shaken, his voice, for the first time in what felt like forever, had failed him. With each sentence, Vance stopped being merely the vice president. He became, in the eyes of many watching, a leader they could trust. Someone who spoke their language, understood their struggles, shared their values. The moderators tried to steady the room, to carve order out of the chaos that had overtaken the proceedings, but the audience wouldn't be quieted. The energy was too powerful, too raw, too real. Chants of Vance, Vance, Vance rose from the crowd and were carried live into millions of homes across America and around the world. Overseas, soldiers watched the broadcast and cheered along with their compatriots at home. In nursing homes throughout the country, veterans who had served their nation decades ago stood and saluted the screen, some weeping openly at what they were witnessing. Families bowed their heads in prayer, grateful for words that sounded like courage, grateful that someone had finally stood up and spoken truth in a time when truth seemed in dangerously short supply. Vance raised a hand, and slowly the noise in the studio softened. He looked directly into the camera lens, speaking not just to the audience in the room, but to every American watching from wherever they happened to be. "Tonight, the truth has been named," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "This isn't about me or President Trump or Barack Obama." He paused, his expression softening. "It's about you, the people." The words were simple, but they carried profound meaning for millions who heard them. "You are the soul of this country. No smear, no lie will silence you again." The room exploded anew. Obama's eyes dropped to the desk before him. He seemed defeated in a way that was painful to witness, even for his critics. The commanding voice that had once rallied millions to his cause felt diminished, overwhelmed by the tide that had turned against him. Trump sat tall, visibly proud of his running mate. In that instant, for so many watching, the choice had been made. Vance was no longer just defending a president. He was defending a future. The scene rippled across the globe with the speed of modern communication. Broadcasters in Europe, Asia, and Africa cut into their regular programming to show clips of the exchange. Headlines wrote themselves in real time. "Obama silenced. Historic clash in U.S. politics. The debate that changed everything." In London, pub crowds watched in stunned silence as the American political drama unfolded. In Israel, commentators lauded Vance's boldness and composure. Even in places where Obama had once been admired, people were asking what they had just witnessed. The untouchable had been challenged in plain sight, and the challenger had prevailed. Inside the studio, Vance's composure never cracked. His words weren't laced with anger or bitterness. They were infused with conviction, with the certainty of someone who believed absolutely in what he was saying. "Truth isn't meant to make the comfortable comfortable," Vance said, his voice clear and strong. "It's meant to free the forgotten." Tears streamed down faces throughout the crowd as applause washed through the audience in waves. Obama lowered his head, the weight of the moment settling over him like a physical burden. He had expected to dominate this debate. Instead, a younger, hungrier voice had cut through his polished rhetoric and connected with the American people in ways he no longer could. Trump folded his arms and looked at Vance with unmistakable approval. The passing of a torch, whether literal or symbolic, was no longer hidden. It was happening in plain sight, broadcast live to the world. The applause shifted into something deeper, gentler, more raw. A veteran in the front row continued saluting through his tears. A mother clutched her child close and whispered, Maybe now they'll have a chance." Vance blinked, visibly moved by the emotion in the room. Then he steadied himself and spoke again. "This fight isn't for tonight alone," he said. "It's for every person who felt ignored, betrayed, forgotten." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces before him. "You aren't forgotten anymore." The crowd's roar mixed sorrow with joy in equal measure. Strangers embraced, united by the shared experience of witnessing something they would never forget. Some sank to their knees, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. Cameras captured it all, not just a political spectacle, but a country peeling open its heart, revealing its wounds, finding perhaps the beginning of healing. Obama sat rigid in his chair, face pale, staring at the floor before him. The narrative had shifted completely. People were choosing a side, and it wasn't his. For the first time in years, many viewers wept tears of hope instead of despair. The moderators attempted one last futile call to restore order, but the verdict of the night had already been delivered by the audience itself. Vance's final lines landed like a closing bell. Steady, deliberate, impossible to ignore. "Mr. Obama," he said, his voice clear and strong, "the people have seen the truth." He paused, letting the statement resonate throughout the silent studio. "America belongs to Americans, not to politicians who sold us out." The words cut through the air with the precision of a surgeon's blade. "The age of false promises is over. The age of real strength begins now." A tidal wave of applause followed, crashing through the studio with a force that seemed almost physical. Trump leaned forward and murmured to his vice president, his words barely audible but caught by the sensitive microphones. "You did what others couldn't." Vance nodded, humble yet resolute. He had delivered exactly what the moment required, and he knew it. But there was no arrogance in his expression, no triumphalism, only the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Across the nation, households exploded into celebration. Families rose from couches that had been silent throughout the debate. Veterans murmured prayers of thanks. Children pointed at the television screen in awe, asking their parents what they had just witnessed. "That man," fathers told their sons and daughters, "that man just stood up for us." The studio lights seemed harsher on Obama now, revealing the doubt where there had once been an unshakable aura of confidence. Reporters whispered among themselves, already drafting headlines that would dominate the morning news cycle. A night intended as Obama's showcase had become, in the span of minutes, a national rebuke. The commanding voice that had once rallied millions felt diminished, overwhelmed by the authentic passion of a younger generation finally finding its voice. Vance, composed and quiet, folded his hands on the desk before him and let silence do the rest. The silence of victory. Trump's expression was proud, and justifiably so. He had fought alone for years, facing down critics and enemies who seemed to multiply with each passing day. Tonight, for the first time in a long time, he stood with a partner who carried truth with both strength and humility. The audience understood what they were witnessing. Some wept openly, aware they had watched a political giant's decline and another's rise. It felt like watching the turning of an age, the passing of one era and the beginning of another. Across living rooms throughout America, parents caught their children close and told them to remember this night. Remember the courage it took to speak plainly to power. Remember what it looked like when someone finally stood up. In Texas, a grandmother bowed her head in prayer, thankful for leaders who dared to stand for what was right. Soldiers overseas watched the broadcast and saluted, as if Vance had spoken directly to them across the miles that separated them from home. The standing ovation surged again through the studio. "USA! USA!" reverberated through the set, shaking the foundations. Vance held the moment, absorbing the energy of the crowd, then offered a closing promise. "This is the beginning," he said, his voice strong and certain. "Truth will outpace lies. Courage will outshine fear. The people, not the politicians, will lead the way." The debate concluded, but Vance's words lingered in the air like an echo that refused to fade. Obama departed quietly, his head bowed. The confident stride that had carried him through so many public appearances seemed diminished, weighed down by the defeat he had just experienced. Trump and Vance stood side by side as the crowd's cheers swelled to a final crescendo. Outside the studio, people had gathered in impromptu celebration. Car horns honked, flags waved, strangers hugged in the streets, united by what they had just witnessed. For those watching, something historic had happened. Lies had been hushed. Truth was on the rise. Vance's final cadence echoed in the minds of millions. "America is not broken. America is alive. With faith and courage, we will be greater." Cameras recorded every heart-stirring second, tears and salutes. Children pointing at screens, families praying together. The morning headlines would call it a defining moment. The night that changed American politics, the debate that shocked the world. But for the millions who witnessed it live, it was more than news. It felt personal. It felt like vindication for years of being dismissed, ignored, and ridiculed. It felt like hope. Before we go deeper, I would love to hear your point of view. Tell me what part hit you the hardest in the story and share your thoughts in the comments. The aftermath of the debate rippled through American society for days and weeks that followed. Political analysts struggled to explain what had happened. Commentators who had expected an Obama victory were forced to reckon with a new reality. JD Vance had emerged as something more than a vice president. He had become a symbol of courage, of plain speaking, of standing up for the forgotten men and women who had felt abandoned by both political parties for decades. Social media remained flooded with clips from the debate. The moment when Vance first challenged Obama directly, the exchange about the Russia collusion narrative, the devastating line about Biden being pushed forward despite being visibly diminished. Each clip was shared millions of times, commented on, analyzed, celebrated, and criticized. But through it all, one thing remained clear. Something had shifted in American politics that night. The old rules no longer applied. The assumption that certain figures were beyond challenge had been shattered. A new generation was rising, and JD Vance had announced their arrival in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. In the days following the debate, Trump was asked repeatedly about his running mate's performance. "He said what needed to be said," Trump replied, his expression proud. "JD speaks for the people. That's what I saw in him from the beginning. That's why I chose him." For his part, Vance remained humble about his performance. deflecting praise to the voters who had given him and Trump their mandate. "I didn't say anything the American people didn't already know," he said in interviews. "I just gave voice to what they've been feeling. That's not courage, that's just honesty." But for millions who had watched, it was courage. Courage to stand on a national stage and challenge a former president? Courage to speak uncomfortable truths when easier words were available? Courage to represent the forgotten and the overlooked at the highest levels of American politics. The debate became a reference point in American political culture. "Remember when Vance took on Obama" became a shorthand for moments of unexpected political courage. The clips continued to circulate for years afterward, shown to new generations as an example of what political discourse could look like when someone refused to play by the old rules. Obama, for his part, retreated from the public spotlight in the weeks following the debate. His public appearances became less frequent, his statements more measured. The defeat had clearly affected him in ways that went beyond politics. But in living rooms across America, in factory towns and farming communities, in suburban neighborhoods and urban apartments, people remembered what they had witnessed. They remembered the night someone finally spoke for them. They remembered JD Vance. And they remembered that truth, when spoken with conviction and courage, could change everything. The morning after the debate, America woke to a changed political landscape. Television screens that had carried the live broadcast now replayed the most powerful moments on an endless loop. Newspapers that had gone to press expecting one narrative scrambled to rewrite their front pages. Radio hosts who had prepared commentary for an Obama victory found themselves discussing something entirely different. JD Vance had become the story. Not Trump's controversial policies, not Obama's attempted takedown, but the young vice president who had stood his ground and spoken truth when truth was the most dangerous currency in the room. In households across the nation, conversations that had been stuck in partisan gridlock suddenly found new ground. Families who had been divided by politics discovered common ground in their appreciation for plain speaking and authentic conviction. "Did you see what Vance said?" became the question of the day. And in the answers to that question, something remarkable was happening. People were talking to each other again, not yelling, not accusing, not retreating into their ideological corners, but actually talking about what they had seen, about what it meant, about what they hoped for their country. The debate had been broadcast around the world, and international reactions continued to pour in. European commentators, many of whom had dismissed the Trump administration as chaos incarnate, were forced to reckon with the articulate, composed figure of JD Vance. "This is not what we expected," one British analyst admitted on air. "This was a display of political skill that rivals anything we've seen in decades." In Asia, the debate was analyzed through the lens of American influence on global affairs. What did this moment mean for international relations? What did the rise of this new voice portend for American foreign policy? But perhaps the most significant reactions came from ordinary Americans who had never expected to feel represented by anyone in Washington. Factory workers in the Rust Belt who had watched their jobs disappear and their communities hollow out finally felt like someone had spoken their truth on a national stage. Veterans who had served their country and returned to find inadequate care and broken promises finally felt like someone understood their sacrifice. Parents who had buried children to drug overdoses finally felt like someone recognized their grief. The debate had given voice to the voiceless, and in that voice, many found something they had been missing for years: hope. The weeks that followed saw a transformation in American political discourse. The moment had shifted something fundamental in the conversation. Politicians on both sides of the aisle were forced to reckon with the expectations the debate had created. Authenticity became the new currency. Plain speaking replaced political calculation, and at the center of it all stood JD Vance, the young vice president who had changed the game with one unforgettable night. Trump, for his part, embraced the new dynamic. JD showed the country what we're fighting for, he said in the days following the debate. He showed them what real leadership looks like, not polished speeches and empty promises, real words for real people. The partnership between the president and vice president deepened in the aftermath. What had been seen as a strategic selection became something more, a genuine collaboration between two very different men, united by a common vision. Vance continued to speak out, carrying the momentum of the debate into subsequent appearances and interviews. But he remained grounded, refusing to let the attention change who he was or what he believed. "I'm just saying what needs to be said," he repeated when asked about his newfound prominence. "The American people deserve honesty. They've been lied to for too long. By politicians who promise everything and deliver nothing. By media outlets that tell them what to think instead of giving them the facts. By a system that serves itself instead of serving them." His words resonated because they rang true, and in a political landscape polluted by spin and calculation, truth was a revolutionary act. The debate became a touchstone for a generation. Young people who had grown cynical about politics found something to believe in. They shared clips on social media, discussed the exchange in their schools and workplaces, and for the first time in years, engaged with the political process as something more than a spectator sport. Older Americans who had given up hope of ever seeing real change found their faith renewed. They volunteered for campaigns, contributed to causes they believed in, and emerged from the apathy that had defined their relationship with politics for decades. The conversation had changed, and it had changed because one man had the courage to speak plainly on a national stage. The legacy of that night continued to unfold in the months and years that followed. Political scientists studied the exchange as a case study in effective communication. Communication experts analyzed Vance's delivery for lessons in persuasion. Historians placed the debate in the context of great American political moments, but for ordinary people the significance was simpler. Someone had finally stood up. Someone had finally spoken for them. Someone had finally told the truth. And in that truth, they found something they had been missing. A reason to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. A reason to believe that their voices mattered. A reason to believe in America again. If this story moved you, if it stirred pride or hope, or simply made you think about what's possible when someone has the courage to speak truth, don't just let it pass. This is the kind of story that reminds us why standing up matters, why speaking plainly matters, why believing in something bigger than ourselves matters. You've stayed with us through this incredible journey, watching as JD Vance rose to meet a moment that demanded courage and delivered exactly that. And now, I want to thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community that values truth, courage, and the stories that shape our nation. If you haven't already, take a moment to like this video. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories like this. Stories that matter, stories that inspire, stories that remind us of what's possible when ordinary people refuse to stay silent. Subscribe to Celebrity Chronicles if you want to be part of a community that celebrates courage and truth. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story, and most importantly, share your thoughts in the comments below. Which line from this debate hit you the hardest? What moment made you feel something? What did this story mean to you? I read every single comment, and I'm genuinely curious to hear your perspective because at the end of the day, stories like this one don't belong to any one person. They belong to all of us. They're part of our shared history, our collective memory, our ongoing conversation about who we are and who we want to become. That night on the debate stage, JD Vance reminded millions of Americans that their voices matter. That truth can be spoken even when it's inconvenient. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important. So let tonight be a reminder, your voice matters too. Don't be afraid to speak your truth. Don't be afraid to stand up for what you believe. Don't be afraid to be the one person in the room who says what everyone else is thinking, because that's how change happens. One voice at a time, one moment of courage at a time, one truth spoken at a time. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this journey, and thank you for being part of the Celebrity Chronicles family. Until next time, remember, the stories that change us are the stories we share. Share this one with someone who needs to hear it, and let tonight be the first step toward making history together. God bless you, and God bless America.